Hi, and thank you for tuning into the Nature Conversations podcast. I'm Dr Adam Forbes. I'm a forest ecologist who specialises in the restoration of New Zealand's forest ecosystems. This podcast isn't about me, however. The purpose of the Nature Conversations podcast is to capture knowledge and insights from remarkable people and to profile important issues for ecology and nature conservation. Colin has been keen on natural history all of his life and has progressed through a long career with the New Zealand Department of Conservation. He is currently the Curator of Vertebrates at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa, Tongarewa. Colin joined me on the podcast to discuss his big adventure, walking the length of New Zealand and counting all the birds he saw or heard from the trail, both day and night.
We weren't always walking in close earshot, but sometimes we'd catch up and he'd say, "Did you see or hear X?" But he commented that there was only one time when he heard me let out a whoop. And that was actually when we saw a khaki black stilt just south of Twizel on the Ohau River. And part of the context there is not only is it a very rare bird, but it was one that I was hoping to see so I could tell its story in the blog series. There were places where we were walking, particularly in the beech forests of the South Island, where I had done a bit of tramping at the same sites as a student, and so we're talking 30, 40 years ago, and just the rarity of some of the species that I used to think of as common beech forest birds, so particularly kakariki, yellow-crowned parakeet, way less common than they used to be. So that's just a reminder of the gradual chipping away and shifting of baselines that people who go into those forests now would think of kakariki as a rare bird, whereas in my youth they were a common bird in beech forests. And yeah, so that's just a reminder of the ongoing impact of introduced predators.
I'm very excited to have Colin Miskelly on Nature Conversations. How are you today, Colin?
I'm doing great, thanks, Adam.
Could you please explain a little bit about your professional background and how you came to work with vertebrates at Te Papa?
Yeah, well, I've been keen on natural history all my life, really, but I joined what was then called the Ornithological Society, so now Birds New Zealand, as a 13-year-old. So I was very, very keen as a teenager and got some great opportunities and ended up going to Canterbury University for my undergrad and then postgraduate research, and did a PhD on the ecology of New Zealand snipe, so mainly down on the Snares Islands, south of Rakiura, Stewart Island, but also out on the Chatham Islands. And then my first full-time job was with DOC, and I worked for Department of Conservation for 19 years, initially on the West Coast, then moved to Wellington only a year or so later. And I had several roles there, initially Conservancy Advisory Scientist, so that even though I was trained as a scientist, and that was my passion, that was the only time I actually had scientist in my job title with DOC. But after about 7 years in a restructuring, I ended up as a technical support manager. But during that, probably the next decade, I had a lot to do with the Chatham Islands, because Wellington Conservancy, where I worked, had administrative responsibilities for conservation out on the Chathams. And then my last couple of years with DOC, I moved into a role called Conservation Analyst. And fortunately, during my time as manager and analyst, I'd still maintained a bit of scientific output, so mainly in my weekends and evenings. So when the Te Papa curator position was advertised, I'd still been getting enough output, I suppose, that I was a potential contender for the role. So here at Te Papa, my current job title is Curator of Vertebrates, with responsibilities mainly for birds and reptiles. But my predecessor, and in fact the two people who held the role before me, were birds only. So pretty much when I came in here, the reptiles and land mammals needed a bit of attention. So even though I'm a bird guy, I've put a bit of energy into those in the 14 years that I've been at Te Papa.
Oh, what a fascinating background, Colin. Thanks for explaining that. What I wanted to ask you about was, I understand that more recently you've made quite a major undertaking and walked the Te Araroa Trail. and made some natural history observations along the way. Would you mind telling us about what you did and why you did that?
Yeah, there was a great adventure. It was a year ago, so I was out on the trail walking this time 12 months ago. Te Araroa runs the length of New Zealand's North and South Islands. Probably about 90% of people do it north to south. They start at Curator and end up near Bluff, which is the direction I did it. And it was over last summer, so what's that, 23, 24, and that happened to be the final summer of a 5-year project run by Birds New Zealand on the New Zealand Bird Atlas scheme. So that was part of my focus, was to count every individual bird that I could see and hear from Te Araroa as I walked south, which was a distance of 3,226 kilometres, according to my GPS stopwatch, which is slightly more than the distance that the official trail says. But what I was doing was counting birds in 2-kilometre transects, which is a technique that I'd developed on my training walks, mainly around the hills of Wellington, but using a GPS-enabled stopwatch to give me a buzz every kilometre. And at the midpoint of each transect, I'd record the GPS waypoints. And then after 2 kilometres, I'd get a buzz and I'd make a timestamp in my notebook, which is I'm a bit old school. I still use notebook and pencil rather than apps. So start another list and off I'd go again.
Wow, that's an amazing commitment to collecting data while undertaking what's already quite a major achievement. So, were there any species recorded during your walk that you didn't expect to find?
I suppose the unexpected things are vagrants from overseas, and so Birds New Zealand run a scheme for reporting and assessing unusual birds. We call it the Records Appraisal Scheme. So if you see something unexpected or out of range, which could be a vagrant from overseas, or it might be a New Zealand species that's considered extinct or well beyond its known range, then you submit what's called an unusual bird report. And I ended up submitting 2 of those after Te Araroa. So these were birds that were vagrants to New Zealand that were not known about. So there were others that I encountered on the way south that people already knew about. I'll come back to those. But the 2 that I found that I submitted UBRs for were a ironically named common tern on 90 Mile Beach. So that was only on the 2nd or 3rd day of the walk. So the common tern gets its name from Europe, whereas it is a common species. But in New Zealand, they're getting detected more and more often. Now, they're very, very similar to the white-fronted tern, or tara, which is New Zealand's commonest tern. And so part of it is just learning how to tell a very similar species apart. And often the way that bird watchers go looking for common terns is to look around the edges of large flocks of white-fronted terns that are roosting. And that was the case up on 90 Mile Beach. There were, I think it was about 320 white-fronted terns in a flock, and this common tern was just roosting on the edge of the flock. And then the second one was alongside the Waikato River, was a chestnut-breasted shelduck, which is the Australian equivalent of the paradise shelduck, utangitangi, and very, very similar to it, but quite strikingly patterned, so easily distinguished when the 2 are side by side. So yeah, they were the 2, I suppose, unexpecteds. But a third reportable bird that I also saw just north of Tongarewa Heads was a bird called a wandering tatler, which is a migrant wader species, breeds mainly in Alaska, and usually spends the southern summer on tropical islands in the South Pacific. So 1 or 2 reach New Zealand most summers. But that one I really love just because of its evocative name, and it could almost have been a byline from what I was doing, because we've talked about doing the walk and the counts, but I was also blogging about the birds as I walked south. So I quite like the idea of a wandering tatler, which was pretty much what I was doing, which was walking the length of the country and telling people about the birds.
I love that. That's brilliant. And we'll include if it's okay with you, I'd love to include the link to your blog and the episode description. And also you mentioned the New Zealand Bird Atlas scheme. If there's a resource we can link in so people can access that too, that would be excellent. So tell us about some of your other observations, perhaps the more common ones. Is there anything that you'd say about those?
Yeah, well, that was actually one of the surprises because I mentioned that I was contributing to the New Zealand Bird Atlas scheme, and this was actually the third atlas. So there've been two previous iterations, each of them done roughly 20 years apart. And atlas schemes are very good at showing bird distribution, but they're not so good at giving you metrics on what is the most abundant bird at a site. You can get frequency information, but actual birds per kilometre, which is what I was doing, is not the kind of data that's traditionally been collected during our bird atlas schemes. And so the first atlas scheme, it was pretty much presence absence was what was shown on the very basic graphics. I think it was published in or mid-80s, and so it was pretty much just a 10,000 yard square, which shows it's dated a bit, with X's showing bird recorded here or not during the atlas period. And then the next iteration, they got slightly more technical and showed different side circles showing the frequency of record of each species. Was it just recorded once, or was it recorded just about every time someone went to that 10,000 metre square? And this final iteration is going a bit beyond that. So it's getting us to record, in my case, birds per kilometre, or it might be birds per time. That can give you, I suppose, a heat map. So the eventual outputs we're expecting is that you'll get darker colours showing where these species are recorded more often. But it's still not really telling you, if you walked from A to B, in this case from Cape Rang to Bluff, what species will you encounter most often? And I was actually very surprised to find that the answer was house sparrow, because it is a species, clearly a very common species in urban areas, but it's not particularly common in farmland unless you're a grain farmer. And it's pretty much absent from the native forest. So it's very clustered in its distribution, but it was just so abundant in those, particularly the North Island towns, that it was the only species I recorded that was in 5 digits. So it was more than twice as abundant as the next most abundant species. So I probably should give you some statistics here, is that I counted 106,528 individual birds of 111 species. But yeah, the only one of those that exceeded 10,000 individuals was house sparrow. And then the next two below that were chaffinch and silvereye, which was pretty much expected that they were among the most abundant species.
Wow, what a major effort, Colin. I'm so impressed with that. And I was just thinking as I was listening to you, how or were you able to account for nocturnal birds? Because you might not have been walking at night. Did you make any observations of it during night time?
Yeah, great question. I've sort of really just been explaining what I've been doing in the daytime. And something I would note is if I saw kiwi droppings or feathers, I'd make a note. And that was one of, I suppose, the frustrations for nocturnal birds, is that often where we were staying, whether it was camping grounds or towns, were not great places for kiwi in particular, and more less so ruru, which is the other nocturnal bird you most likely to count. So we were passing through kiwi habitat, but we didn't often get chances to actually hear them or even less see them. But what I did try to do was nocturnal point counts, so particularly where we were within earshot of native forest or any sort of forested landscape, and out of doors. So I'd either sit in my tent, which is pretty easy to do when you've got a thin membrane tent, you can hear what's around you, and do a timed listening. Or sometimes it was more a case of I happened to be awake in the night and I heard a ruru or a kiwi call, so I'd then record how long I was listening for before, write a time in my notebook. So it becomes a count per unit time. But yeah, I did complete quite a series of nocturnal spot counts, which is separate, or point location counts, which is contributing to the scheme, but separate from the diurnal transects that I was walking.
Yeah, excellent, Colin. And another thought I just had was, how do you feel the Te Araroa Trail represents sort of like different habitat types, say like coastal or, maybe some sort of, shoreline habitats versus alpine habitats? Did you get an appreciation for how representative across those different systems your results might be?
It certainly samples the full range of those habitats, but something I was very aware of as a bird enthusiast is that the trail misses some opportunities for really good birds. And one that I touched on a bit ironically was the trail notes emphasise crossing estuaries at low tide, because there are several places where that's the only time you can cross them. But any bird watcher knows that the best time to see wading birds is at high tide, when the tide pushes them up to their high tide roosts. So for the most part, when you're crossing the estuaries, the birds are well dispersed and feeding, and you'll see a few, but you don't see the great aggregations and the chances of picking up rarities among them. But yeah, one exception to that was the Ambury high tide roosts on the Mangere Harbour, where the trail doesn't cross the mudflats, so you're actually on a walkway. And so that's one place where I'd recommend bird enthusiasts to make sure that they walk that section at high tide, because that's when you've got these big aggregations of waders at roosts where there are viewing hides and viewpoints where you can look at them. But that is another challenge of walking the trail, is what optics do you carry? Because usually when you're looking at those kinds of birds, if you're a real keen bird watcher, you'll have a spotting scope and tripod, which are pretty heavy. So I actually arranged to meet up with friends who had the right optics at those sites to help look through the flocks for what was hiding among them. But I did carry a small pair of binoculars on the trail, so that was one of my pieces of kit that I purchased. As a birder, I have binoculars, but I got the sort of smallest, lightest weight pair I could get. Were a new acquisition for Te Araroa, and that, along with the GPS-enabled wristwatch, were among the kit that I purchased specifically for bird watching on the trail.
I'm interested to know, I mean, you're obviously out on the trail for several months to complete such a long distance, and you're putting in all this effort with sampling birds along the way. What was the most memorable moment that you had walking the trail?
That's a tricky one, actually. In a way, I actually talked on the trail. Every day on the trail is a good day. And it was. It's as an ecologist, it's a fascinating way to view your own country, because in a way, and in fact, I should backtrack a bit, that, thinking about Te Araroa for a few years, and initially I was just thinking about doing the backcountry bits. And it was actually when I hit on the idea of counting every single bird that the idea of walking the entire trail had a lot more appeal, because it made the boring bits interesting, because they provided context for the backcountry bits. And so, in a way, even when you're having a quiet bird day, your brain's whirring away thinking about what's going on, why is there so little here, and why is this different from other places. So yeah, lots of highlights, and sometimes in quite backward ways. But I haven't mentioned yet that I actually did the trail with my brother, who's a chemistry professor, so also a scientist, but knowledgeable on birds, but not to the same level of counting every single individual. But he'd alert me to things that I might have not seen, because we're not always, or heard, because we weren't always walking in close earshot, but sometimes we'd catch up and he'd say, did you see or hear X? But he commented that there was only one time when he heard me let out a whoop. And that was actually when we saw a khaki black stilt just south of Twizel on the Ohau River. And part of the context there is not only is it a very rare bird, but it was one that I was hoping to see so I could tell its story in the blog series. But I'd met up with a DOC staff member who was responsible for the khaki recovery program just the afternoon before in Twizel. And we'd already missed good habitat between Tikapa and Twizel, because the birds have pretty much, we were there, this is late February, it's late in the breeding season, so a lot of them have dispersed. And then also Te Araroa Trail, by and large, doesn't go up and down braided riverbeds, which is the perfect habitat for not only khaki but other special birds in the central South Island, things like wrybill, banded dotterel, black-fronted tern, nest on the braided riverbeds. But by and large, the trail is walking parallel with them, or crossing them on bridges, or you're wading across them. So you're just encountering them very briefly. And so we didn't sample the habitat for riverbed birds particularly well, as well as being late in the season. But seeing that khaki, when I've been told pretty much that I think her words were, "You would be lucky to see one." And I was lucky to see one, and that was when I let out the whoop of delight that there was a kaki on the other side of the Ohau River.
Oh, that does sound very memorable, and congratulations on that sighting, Colin. That's well earned, I would say. I've got two final questions for you, Colin. One is, if someone was interested in getting into bird watching, as a newbie, would you have any advice for how they could get started?
Well, obviously, Birds New Zealand as a group is a great way to meet other bird enthusiasts and get opportunities to participate in fieldwork and find out what birding trips are happening in your region. And particularly in the major regions, there are typically monthly meetings, and increasingly the regions are sharing those on Zoom. So if you're not able to physically attend the meetings, you can still listen in. So that's one way. There's heaps of birding resources. I was loading all my observations onto the eBird platform. There was actually a separate Atlas portal. Now, you asked earlier, can I share a link with that? I could, but the Atlas scheme itself has finished. It finished at the end of May this year. And so it's now in a period of data analysis, and there will eventually be an output. But at the moment, people could read about the scheme, but they can't contribute to it because the 5-year data collection period's finished. But eBird, which is the platform that that we are using to capture that data, is just an ongoing, massive, global citizen science platform. And so that's a place where people can not only load their own sightings and photographs and sound recordings, but it's a great way to capture your own data, whether you're a traditionalist notebook user and writing down all your own observations longhand. That platform allows your data to be accessible to yourself. You can get your own downloads back, but you're also contributing things like, if you hear the first pipiwharaora, shining cuckoo, which is a migratory bird in the country, then that contributes to where were these birds first heard as they return from migration, which of course is a really big deal in North America, where eBird is based out of Cornell University. But here in New Zealand, we don't have many. In fact, we really only have the two land birds that are migrants. So the shining cuckoo, pipiwharaora, sort of goes up to sort of New Hebrides, where we're talking Solomon Islands, around there, in the New Zealand winter. And the long-tailed cuckoo, koikoia, spreads out all across the South Pacific, from sort of Micronesia in the west right over to Tahiti and beyond in the east. And they return to New Zealand usually about a month later than the shining cuckoos. And so hearing your first cuckoo of either species of the spring is one of those annual landmark events. And eBird is an ideal platform to record that nationally, to see where these birds are turning up and as they're gradually moving south along the country. So that's just one example, but you can use it for recording changes over time, but also changes between habitats. So you can go on, and if you're a keen birder and you want to know where rare birds have turned up, then you can use eBird to see where is the species at the moment. If I want to see it, where is the best place to go? So you get data out of it as well as putting data in.
Oh, fantastic, Colin. And we'll include links to the Birds New Zealand website and to eBird as well in the description, in the episode description, so people can follow up on that. My final question for you, Colin, coming back to the walk itself, Te Araroa, if someone was considering doing that, would you have any particular advice or any words you'd say about that?
Probably the main thing, particularly unless you're young and fit and active, is do lots of training. In my case, I actually ended up probably doing way more than I needed to, and a little bit of that is that Te Araroa didn't really register on my to-do list until quite late in the Atlas period, but round about the middle of the Atlas period, I did do a 3-week tramping trip to Rakiura, Stewart Island, so roughly 300 kilometres, walking the Northwest Circuit, Southern Circuit, and Rakiura Great Walk. And I did quite a bit of training before that just to get myself fit. And it was after completing that I thought, well, that's roughly 10% the length of Te Araroa, and I still feel pretty good, so maybe I should keep going. And I think I had other plans the following summer, but it meant that in the end I did 3 years of training, and what I would do was go for quite long walks, like other people would play around a golf at the weekend, but I'd strap on a pack with maybe 10 kgs of ballast, carrying extra water just to get a bit of weight, and then walk the hills around Wellington counting the birds, developing my transect technique. So it meant I got to know the hills of Wellington very well. And as I said, they're hills. So I did a lot of hill climbing and training for 3 years, effectively every weekend, just going for one long walk. And I'm talking 20 to 30k walks, which is pretty much what you end up doing on Te Araroa. An average day would be walking for 7 or 8 hours and 28 to 30k. The longest day we did by time was 14 hours in the Araroa Ranges, and the longest distance was 49 kilometres. But that was just carrying day packs. It was when I was close to home in Wellington, so my wife was able to drop us off, because we were what's referred to as every last inch walkers, which means that we would always return to where we had finished the day before, which often it's at your tent because you're pitching your tent where you've reached, but particularly when we were near cities. Gordon, my brother, lives in Auckland, and I was in Wellington, and we had other friends around the country who were happy to pick us up and drop us off for a day or two each side of those towns. So we would then do what's called slack packing, which is just carrying minimal weight, because all your camping gear and stuff's at your base for a few days, secure. You don't need to worry about someone pinching it. And so, we slack packed from Paikokariki to Ngaio in Wellington, which is 49 kilometres, which is a long day. That was a biggie, but it was partly that we'd arranged to sail across Cook Strait on a friend's yacht to get to Ship Cove, where the trail starts again. And there was a southerly front coming through, so Mike had told us, unless you can get ahead of schedule, we're going to have to sit it out and wait for the wind to blow through for a few days. So that's why we'd put in those 2 long days. So they sound scary numbers, but that's just because we're crazy buggers trying to catch a yacht a day early. You have to be, I suppose, prepared to walk typically 8 hours a day and 30 plus Ks. And so unless you are physically capable of doing that, it's going to be a very long trip. And we haven't actually touched on, in our case, we took just over 4 months, so 4 months, 1 week, pretty much. During that time, we had 7 0 days, including crossing Cook Strait. But of course, being a bird watcher, I chucked in a few other things, including a pelagic seabird trip out from Tutakaka, so I blew a day doing that. There was one day when we sat out the rain in near Lewis Pass, our Boyle village. So we were actually very lucky with the weather. That was the only day when it just poured down the whole day. And there were probably only 2 or 3 days in the entire 4 months that I recall pretty much the whole day being raincoats on and having my notebook in a plastic bag and thinking that the weather is actually affecting the bird counts. Whereas, of course, a lot of other days you just get passing showers, or you might have your raincoat on as a precaution. They're really, only a couple of days that stick in my mind as being wet days. So we were pretty lucky.
Oh, that's amazing, Colin. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the listeners, about your adventure here, or anything else that you'd like to comment on?
Well, something we haven't really touched on is, I suppose, the disappointments of the trail. And there were places where we were walking, particularly in the beech forests of the South Island, where I had done a bit of tramping at the same sites as a student. And so we're talking 30, 40 years ago. And just the rarity of some of the species that I used to think of as common beech forest birds, so particularly kakariki, yellow-crowned parakeet, way less common than they used to be. So that's just a reminder of the gradual chipping away and shifting of baselines, that people who go into those forests now would think of kakariki as a rare bird, whereas in my youth they were a common bird in beech forests. And so that's just a reminder of the ongoing impact of introduced predators. And it does remind me too, actually, that something I was doing as I was walking was recording presence or absence of traps, particularly ones targeting stoats and ship rats. So, Doc 200, Doc 150 traps, and trying to record or make sense of whether or not trapping made any difference to the native birds that I was encountering. And I'd prefer not to spill the beans on that, partly because I've already submitted a scientific paper. So, that's a question about what's happening with all this data. It's contributed to the Atlas scheme. It was in the series of blogs. So there's 20 blogs about the different sections of the country and the birds encountered. But I've also submitted a paper to the journal Natornis. It's still in the review process, so I'm not sure if and when that'll come out. But one of the topics that I present in there is basically a table of all of our endemic forest birds and their response or not to predator trapping over what was effectively a 1,000 kilometre forest transect, because from memory that's about right that of the 3,000 kilometres, about a third of it was forest, and that was where I was recording presence or absence of traps. So watch this space. But the main take-home message, I think, is that there are so many predators out there that there's very few places where predator control is intensive enough to make enough difference. And so, we're really going to have to up our game if we want to turn around the decline of a lot of our endemic birds.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. It's such a serious message, and thank you for making that point. And I also note your reference to the rolling baseline, and that's such an issue for us too in terms of our appreciation of issues in intergenerational timeframes. So, no, I really appreciate those points. Well, I think we might wrap it up there. Thank you. I will include the link to your blog so people can dive into more detail on your epic achievement here. And I'll just say thank you very much for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Colin.
Colin's story describes an amazing undertaking. 3 years of training, developing a suitable survey method, then walking the length of New Zealand and undertaking a continuous bird survey while on the trail, both day and night, and counting predator traps along the way. Colin counted a total of 106,528 individual birds of 111 species. Colin's combination of technical skills and long-distance walking ability makes this achievement unique, and what an amazing data set to be able to contribute to New Zealand science. Colin gave encouraging advice for people to get into bird watching, and also some advice for walking the Araroa Trail. Towards the end of our discussion, Colin made some interesting reflections over beech forest areas he had visited on the trail that he was familiar with from his student days, and how birds that were once common there are now rare. Colin mentioned the rolling baseline concept, and how over time we lose perspective of what we have lost. He gave Kakariki yellow-crowned parakeet as an example from the beech forests, being common in his youth and now considered rare. He was very clear about the huge abundance of predators in our landscapes nationwide, and the role those pests continue to have at eroding away at our endemic bird populations. Thanks for bringing our attention back to this important fact, Colin. I feel that in this conversation with Colin, I was just starting to scratch the surface of things that we could talk about. Thanks for sharing your time to come on the podcast, and congratulations on your big walk and survey, Colin. And all the best for your next endeavour. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Nature Conversations podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, remember to subscribe so that you can be notified of future episodes. If you'd like to help support the production of the podcast, you can do so via my Patreon account. The link is in the episode description. Thanks very much for listening, and be sure to check in again soon.